Without those two latter parts, I don't think we'd be where we are. So the experience that we have on trying to build this reverence and comprehension for the way the system works is working from the individual farmer and rancher all the way up to the highest levels of water districts and governing bodies. But it's an example that has yet to be played out, and the question is whether we will have the time to do this. It is tick, tick, tick going on, and we have but probably just a few years to get that salinity back to 10,000 milligrams per liter to save the indigenous fish. So all players must be involved in the system because it is a system. There are unbiased science is really critical. People have to trust you and believe that you're doing this for the good of them. And that requires a fair amount of communication, which requires excellent media activity. And then without a resource, without the money to purchase the resources, we would be nowhere. So those are some examples of scales of thinking from global to practical experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And actually that prepares the ground very well for you, Julie, doesn't it, actually, with that very nice example from Nevada. And you're thinking all the time on a much more global scale. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just say one thing about what Stephen said before I start on my specific comments, and that is, of course, the system thinking, I think, is something that we all believe in, and we've got to stop talking about it and do it, introduce it in our education system and so on. You mentioned the United States, and I don't know whether many people know that about 20 years ago or so, the United States government actually demonstrated system thinking by putting together a global change research program involving not only one department or one ministry, I guess it's called departments, but a number of them. And that is how actually there started to be funding in the early days for climate change research, not enough. I'm hoping that this will also happen now for biodiversity and ecosystems. So let me come to my own particular point of view from IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. First of all, this term global commons is a bit old-fashioned. We haven't used it for many years. It used to, I think, refer to oceans, fisheries, air, water, things that belong to all of us. And it's a nice term. I'd like to just stress here, if that's the title of our session, discipline, is that let's consider natural resources, nature, as a part of the global commons. So that tree over there doesn't only belong to whoever owns that mansion behind that fence, but it also actually belongs to all of us. So this Anatomy of a Silent Crisis, which I think is a very good book, also talks about the fact that reminds us, I think we all know this, but we have to be reminded, especially when we live in rich places like Geneva, that the least responsible for climate change will be affected the most by it, and these are the poor and the vulnerable, and there are billions of them. I'm not going to remind you of the number of people who live on less than $2 a day, but that figure hasn't improved a whole lot since we first started to talk about that. And of course the impacts of climate change will be strongly felt on the global commons, and remember I said nature is really a part of that. So you know all this: drought, floods, loss of biodiversity, erosion, drying of rivers, invasive species. I've just been out visiting some of our activities in the Pacific Islands that are just overtaken by species introduced, brought in by boats, brought in for tourism and destroying the native species. So this situation is already bleak, and I think we have to remember that, and climate change is only making it worse. But even if we didn't have the climate issue, there's 7 billion of us, and we're not taking care of the global commons as much as we should. So, and we also know very well now, as a result of the long study that was completed in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, that there is a severe loss of what scientists called ecosystem services. It's what ecosystems provide us: water, food, flood regulation, and so on, clean air. And so we are spending our natural capital, which is really our greatest asset, way too quickly. So our message all this year, last year, certainly moving toward Copenhagen and moving toward next year, which will be the International Year of Biodiversity, and the two issues are really connected, is that we have to invest in nature. And Pavan, if you weren't here, I actually use quite a lot of your speeches, because we work very closely together on how to invest in nature, how we can protect and manage it, and govern it, and this can't wait. And there are some economic figures, and I'll let Pavan do that, but you'll be glad to know that I speak about this everywhere because we all have to speak in the same way. Now, some of the things that IUCN is really pushing, and finally, I think with some success, is that the ecosystem-based adaptation is related to climate change and also to protecting our global commons. So what does this mean? It means the management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystems to allow them to continue to provide us with the services that we needed. Examples are obviously watershed management so that we can store water and regulate floods, for example, the management of agricultural lands so that we use local knowledge in order to plant the crops that will actually survive and use livestock which are appropriate for that particular part of the global commons, which is nature. So ecosystem-based adaptation are often more accessible to the rural poor than actions based on infrastructure and engineering. And we need to remember that nature-based solutions, I'm not against engineered human-made solutions, but before we build a huge dam, before we build a water purification facility, let's think whether nature, if we take care of it, nature, global commons, can't provide the solution that's more accessible, more affordable to the poor communities. And of course, these are the people about whom we have to think in a systems way also, and that's not always easy. So then, of course, there are very, very strong links between adaptation and mitigation. Many of you know about the newest acronym on the sea of acronyms that we all work in, and I'm totally against acronyms. REDD, R-E-D-D, which is not the color red misspelled, but the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And of course, this is a possibility not only to look at forests, now we know that they store carbon, but forests, if we keep them standing and not do all that logging, it was your story, yes, I know that story. By the way, the punishment for illegal logging is way too low. It's worth it for those people to get caught, pay it off, and continue doing it. We've got to have a legal system also as a part of the system. So obviously, forests store carbon, but they also provide livelihoods for the forest-dwelling communities, and there are many of those. And of course, they also allow us to conserve biodiversity. So we are very much pushing for the post-2012 agreement in Copenhagen must include paying attention to nature, nature-based solutions, the global commons. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Well, let me hand the mic straight on to you, Pavan, because actually that all connects very nicely since you've introduced him so well as well.
Thanks, David, and thanks also, Julia, for setting up the conversation so nicely for me. Because, as Julia said, the commons, a lot of the commons are nature. Clean air, fresh water, the existence of trees, the services that nature provides. These are public goods and services, and that's what the commons, the global commons, are about. Economists will define the global commons as public goods and services which are available to everyone, and your enjoyment does not prevent anybody else's enjoyment of these. So that's the background. Now, why is it important? I think we live in times where public wealth and private wealth seem to stand on two different pedestals. Private wealth stands on the big one, which is about 100 feet high. Everyone sees it and everyone aims for it. And public wealth stands on the slightly lower pedestal, about 1 foot high, which nobody really sees because everyone's looking up. And this would be fine so long as it didn't actually affect our investment in public assets versus private assets. And it would be fine if our development models, if you like, the current development paradigm that is being followed by governments, by international institutions and funders, were not so blatantly targeted at the increase and generation of more private wealth, which is actually fine for people like you and me. I'm assuming nobody here is from a small village in India or a small community in Africa. But when you look at the impact of these decisions, these implicit and explicit choices between public wealth and private wealth, public goods and private goods, when you look at the impact of that on the poor, you have to recognize that, in fact, their poverty is about asset poverty. They don't have private assets. They don't have private wealth. So therefore, their only wealth is actually public wealth. And if you, the government, or you, the institution, are not funding or looking after that public wealth, then you are neglecting the livelihood security of the poor. And this brings me to the nub of the issue. My project, which David and Julia mentioned, TEEB, on the economics for ecosystems and biodiversity,